Cedar Hollow sat where the Texas hill country went from green to gold, a scatter of limestone buildings around a courthouse square that had been rebuilt twice since the war. On the second Sunday of April in 1887, the whole county had turned out for the church social on the lawn behind the Baptist chapel, tables of cornbread and peach preserves set under the live oaks, when Gideon Calder's freight wagon came apart at the tongue on the hill above the church and its team bolted straight down through the churchyard gate. There was screaming before anyone understood why. Delphine Hargrove was standing near the fence with a basket of bread on her hip, and she did not run, because there was nowhere to run to, and Gideon Calder came off his own mount at a dead sprint and caught her around the waist and threw them both clear of the wheels with less than a second to spare. The wagon splintered against the fence post where she had been standing. For a moment nobody moved. Then Mrs. Cordelia Vane, the reverend's wife, put her hand to her mouth and said, loud enough for the whole churchyard to hear, that Gideon Calder had his arms around Delphine Hargrove in front of God and the entire congregation, and something would have to be done about it. Delphine, 34 years old and known to Cedar Hollow mainly as the Hargrove Spinster, stood up out of the dirt with her bread basket still somehow in one hand and looked at the crowd looking at her, and understood before anyone said another word exactly what kind of Sunday this had become. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Nobody in Cedar Hollow had ever quite decided what to do with Delphine Hargrove. She had come of marrying age at 18, with a decent face and a small inheritance from her mother's people, and there had been a suitor or two in those years, but her father, Dr. Elias Hargrove, had needed her at home after her mother died of childbed fever when Delphine was 11, and by the time she was free to think of her own life, the suitors had married other girls, and the town had quietly filed her under the heading of women who had missed their chance. She had kept her father's house and, without anyone in town much noticing, kept his medical practice running alongside him, boiling instruments, keeping the ledger of dosages, sitting up nights with fever patients while her father slept 2 hours before his rounds. He had taught her because there was no one else to teach, and because Elias Hargrove had watched his own wife die of a fever he could not turn in time, and had come to believe, in a quiet way he never announced from any pulpit, that more hands trained to recognize sickness early meant fewer graves. There had been one suitor, a land surveyor named Otto Brandt, who had courted her seriously the winter she turned 22, until her father took ill with a lung complaint that kept him bedridden through that spring, and Delphine had written Otto a short letter explaining that she could not leave her father to strangers, and Otto Brandt had married a girl from Fredericksburg within the year. Delphine had never spoken of it to anyone in Cedar Hollow, and the town, not knowing the shape of what had actually happened, had simply concluded on its own that Otto had looked her over and thought better of it, which was the version that stuck. She had buried her father 3 years back, and since then she had lived alone in the small stone house behind the old office, tending his physic garden of foxglove and boneset and Culver's root, selling tinctures to women too proud to admit where they'd learned to trust her, and getting called, behind her back and sometimes not so far behind it, an old maid who had let her looks and her chances go to seed among her father's medicine bottles. What the town never troubled itself to learn was that she had set 2 broken arms, delivered 4 babies when the midwife couldn't be roused in time, and sat with more dying neighbors than any minister in the county, and had done all of it quietly, without a shingle over her door, because a woman practicing medicine outright in Cedar Hollow would have drawn more scandal than any amount of good she could do would have been worth. Gideon Calder was 41, a widower 3 years gone, running 4,000 acres of cattle range along Cypress Creek with the help of 2 hired men and his late wife's aunt, Ida Prescott, who kept his house and raised his daughter Hannah, 7 years old and quiet as a held breath since her mother's death. Gideon had no particular opinion of Delphine Hargrove beyond a passing respect. Formed the winter she had walked 2 miles through sleet to lance an abscess on his foreman's hand before it turned to blood poisoning. He had never once considered marrying her, and if anyone had suggested it to him before that April Sunday, he would have laughed the short, unamused laugh of a man with too much land and too little time for foolishness. But Cordelia Vane did not deal in foolishness. She dealt in reputation, and by Tuesday she had walked the matter through Reverend Cobb, through 3 of the church deacons, and through half the women of Cedar Hollow, until the story had hardened into a plain fact. Gideon Calder had held Delphine Hargrove in his arms, in front of the whole congregation, and a decent man did not do that to a decent woman and then ride away. Gideon came to the Hargrove house on a Thursday evening with his hat in his hands, and he did not pretend the visit was anything but what it was. "I expect you've heard what's being said," he told her from the doorstep, not stepping in, not sitting down. "I want you to know I didn't come here to insult you by asking out of obligation, but I've got a daughter who hears every word this town says, and I've got a ranch that can't afford the kind of trouble Cordelia Vane knows how to make for a man." He looked at his hat rather than at her. "If you'd have me, I'd be glad of it. If you wouldn't, I'll find some other way through this, and I won't hold it against you." Delphine studied him for a long moment, the way she studied a patient before she decided what was wrong with them. She had spent 16 years being told, in 100 small ways, that she was a woman nobody had wanted and nobody would want, and here was a man standing on her step, admitting flatly that he did not want her either, only the absence of scandal, and there was something almost restful in his honesty after so many years of the town's polite unkindness. "I'll marry you, Mr. Calder," she said, "but I'll ask one thing of you first. Don't let this town believe you're doing me a charity. I've kept myself and my father's practice for 3 years without help from Cedar Hollow, and I'll keep on being useful to somebody, married or not." Gideon looked up from his hat, surprised, she thought, by the steadiness of it. "I never said charity," he said. "No," she said, "but you were thinking it might look that way to the county." He allowed, after a moment, that she wasn't wrong. They were married the following Saturday, in the same church lawn where the wagon had nearly killed her. A short, plain ceremony that Cordelia Vane attended with the satisfied air of a woman who had engineered a righteous outcome, and that Ida Prescott attended, with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a line. Delphine wore her mother's gray traveling dress, the only good dress she owned, taken in at the waist the night before with her own needle, since there had been no time and no wish to send to San Antonio for anything finer, and carried nothing to the Calder ranch but 2 trunks, her father's leather medical bag, and a wooden case of the tinctures she had spent 3 years learning to make correctly. Hannah Calder stood at her father's side through the whole ceremony in a starched pinafore that plainly belonged to a girl being dressed for an occasion rather than dressed for a mother, and did not once look at Delphine, keeping her eyes fixed instead on a point somewhere past the reverend's shoulder the entire time the vows were spoken. Ida Prescott, when the vows were said, remarked to the woman beside her, not quietly enough, that the county had married Gideon Calder to a spinster with a bag of weeds instead of a proper wife, and time would tell what use that turned out to be. Reverend Cobb, to his credit, read the service with none of his wife's satisfaction in it, and afterward, walking Delphine and Gideon to the wagon, said quietly that he hoped this marriage would find its own footing regardless of the ground it had been built on, which was, Delphine thought, the only honest thing said to her the entire day. The Calder Ranch house was a good 2-story limestone building above Cypress Creek, well kept, with a kitchen that had clearly been run for years by a woman who did not intend to hand it over easily. Ida Prescott showed Delphine to a room at the end of the hall on the first evening with the flat courtesy of a woman performing a duty she resented, and made it plain over supper, in the particular way of a household matriarch establishing territory, that Hannah's meals, Hannah's washing, and Hannah's bedtime were matters already well in hand and requiring no new opinions. Gideon said little at his own table, eating with the tired economy of a man who had been in the saddle since dawn, and Delphine understood within the first week that she had been given no real place in this house at all, only a room and a name. She did not push. She unpacked her trunks, set her father's bag on the shelf of the small room she'd been allotted, and began doing the things nobody had assigned her to do. Mending the hired men's shirts, tending the kitchen garden Ida had let go to weeds behind the smokehouse, walking out at dusk to check the fence line the way her father had taught her to check a patient, methodically, for the thing that was wrong before it became the thing that killed you. Hannah watched her from doorways for the first 2 weeks and said almost nothing. The girl had her mother's fair hair and her father's guarded eyes, and the ranch hands spoke of her, when Delphine overheard them, with the particular gentleness men use for a child who has gone quiet since a death. Delphine did not try to win her. She had learned long ago, sitting with frightened patients, that trying to win a frightened creature only frightened it further. She simply left a cup of warm milk with honey by Hannah's door each night, and said nothing about it. And after 10 days, Hannah began leaving the empty cup outside instead of letting it sit, which Delphine understood, without either of them saying a word, to be the first small thread of something. Ida Prescott's dismissal of Delphine hardened rather than softened as the weeks went on. She corrected Delphine's method of scalding milk pans in front of the hired men. She remarked, within easy hearing, that a woman who had spent her best years playing nurse to her father instead of raising a family of her own had no business now pretending she knew the first thing about running a household or minding a child. One evening in early May, Ida found the row of small brown bottles Delphine kept on the kitchen windowsill, tinctures of feverfew and skullcap she'd made in case anyone on the ranch took sick, and carried the whole tray out to the woodshed without a word, telling Gideon later at supper that she wasn't of a mind to let the house smell like a drugstore on account of somebody's hobby. Delphine found the bottles the next morning, unbroken, set carefully enough on a shelf that she understood Ida had wanted them gone from sight rather than gone entirely, and she brought them back inside and set them on the windowsill again without comment. And Ida, watching from the stove, said nothing either, which was as close to a skirmish as either woman allowed the other to see. Ida kept, without ever saying so directly, a running account of every small thing Delphine did wrong, and made certain Gideon heard the worst of it over supper, while the good of it, the mended shirts, the revived garden, the quiet cup of milk outside a grieving child's door, went unremarked because Ida had simply decided not to see it. The hired men took their cue from the house, mostly, and one of the younger ones, a boy named Hollis, who could not have been more than 19, made the mistake of remarking to another hand, within Delphine's hearing, that the boss had traded a good cook for a woman who smelled of dried weeds and kept company mostly with herself. Delphine said nothing to him directly. She simply stopped setting aside the good cuts of meat for his supper plate, a small and entirely unprovable correction that Hollis noticed within a week and never spoke of her that way again. Gideon, caught between a household he had not asked to disrupt and a wife he had married for the county's sake rather than his own, mostly kept his silence, and Delphine mostly let him, because she had married a stranger under duress, and she did not yet know him well enough to ask for his defense. The trouble that changed everything arrived in the last week of May, when a fever broke out in the tenant families along the lower creek and spread within days into Cedar Hollow itself. Doc Larkin, the only physician for 30 miles, had gone to Austin for his sister's funeral and was not expected back for a fortnight. The first cases looked, to the mothers who saw them, like ordinary sore throats, until the second day, when a gray membrane began to close across the children's throats, and their breathing turned to a thin, terrible rasp that every mother in that county, without needing to be told, recognized as something worse than a cold. By the time word reached the Calder ranch that 3 children in town had died in 2 days, Hannah Calder had already gone to bed with a sore throat she said was nothing, and Delphine, checking on her at midnight out of the same habit that had kept her walking the fence line at dusk, took one look down the child's throat by lamplight and felt her whole body go still in the particular way her father's had gone still, years before, over cases he already knew he might lose. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Get Gideon, Delphine told the hired man at the door, and something in her voice, flat and certain in a way none of them had heard from her before, sent him running rather than walking. Gideon came into his daughter's room half-dressed and found his wife already at work, propping Hannah upright against a mountain of pillows, because she told him lying flat would let the membrane close faster, setting a kettle of water to boil over the bedroom stove for steam, laying out on the washstand a row of items from her father's bag that Gideon had never seen used and did not know the names of. "It's diphtheria," Delphine said, not looking up from her daughter's throat. "I've seen 4 cases with my father. 2 lived. I intend for this to be a 3rd. Ida Prescott, roused by the commotion, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed in the same posture she had worn at the wedding, and said that they ought to send for Doc Larkin regardless, that a woman with a bag of dried weeds was no substitute for a trained physician. "Doc Larkin is 4 days away, even if a rider left this minute," Delphine said, still not turning around. "She doesn't have 4 days. She has tonight." Gideon looked at his aunt, and then at his wife's steady hands, and for the first time since the wedding he made a decision without waiting to hear what Ida thought of it. "Do what you need to do," he said. "Tell me what to fetch." The night that followed was the longest of Gideon Calder's life. Delphine kept the steam kettle going, and the child upright through hour after hour, watching the rise and fall of Hannah's narrow chest with an attention so total that Gideon, sitting on the far side of the bed holding his daughter's hand, understood he was watching something he had no name for, a woman doing the work she had spent her whole life training toward, and no one had thought to ask about. Ida stood in the doorway for the first hour with her arms crossed, watching, and then, without anyone asking her to, went down to the kitchen and came back with more water for the kettle, and after that she stayed, fetching and carrying whatever Delphine named without being told twice. Somewhere near 2 in the morning, Hannah woke enough to be frightened, clawing weakly at her own throat, and Delphine took the child's hands in both of hers and held them still, and spoke to her in a low, even voice about nothing in particular: the smell of the physic garden in June, the sound the creek made over the low rocks below the house, until the small hands stopped fighting, and the breathing, though still thin, steadied. Twice in the night the breathing narrowed to almost nothing, and twice Delphine leaned the child forward and cleared her throat with a slim silver instrument from her father's bag, with hands that did not shake even when Gideon's own were white-knuckled on the bedpost. Gideon asked her once, in a voice scraped thin with fear, whether the child was going to live, and Delphine did not soften it for him. "I don't know yet," she said. "I know what to do if her throat closes. I don't know if it will be enough. I've told you the truth every hour tonight, and I intend to keep doing that, because you deserve it more than you deserve a comfortable lie." He had nodded, and said nothing more, and stayed exactly where he was. Near dawn, the fever broke. Hannah's breathing eased into something that sounded, for the first time since midnight, like an ordinary child sleeping. Delphine sat back in her chair, and only then did Gideon see that her hands, finally still, were trembling. "She'll want broth when she wakes," Delphine said quietly. "Nothing heavier for 3 days. The throat will be raw a good while yet." Gideon looked at his wife across his sleeping daughter, and said the only thing that came to him: "Thank you." Delphine shook her head slightly. "Don't thank me yet. There are 11 more households in this county tonight, with the same fever in them, and half of them don't know to sit their children up instead of laying them flat." She was already reaching for her father's bag again. "I need to go to them." Word of what had happened at the Calder ranch reached Cedar Hollow before Delphine did, carried by the hired man who had ridden for the doctor and turned back partway when he heard the child was saved. By the time Delphine arrived at the first of the sick households along the lower creek, riding a borrowed horse with her father's bag strapped behind the saddle, she was no longer entirely a stranger to what she was walking into, and more than one mother met her at the gate, with an expression that was equal parts fear and a hope she had not expected to feel that morning. She spent the next 6 days moving from house to house through Cedar Hollow and its outlying farms, sitting children upright, boiling instruments in whatever pot a kitchen could spare, teaching frightened mothers with her own hands how to clear a closing throat, sending for lime to whitewash sick rooms, and for vinegar to scrub what the lime couldn't reach, marking each house she'd visited with a strip of white cloth tied to the gatepost so the next rider through would know which families still needed watching. She slept in snatches, an hour here on a borrowed cot, an hour there in the saddle between farms, and ate whatever was pressed into her hands by mothers too frightened and too grateful to let her ride on without something in her stomach. Gideon rode with her on the 3rd day, when his own hired men could manage the ranch without him for a stretch, not because she had asked him to, but because he had found, once his own daughter was out of danger, that he could not sit at home while 13 other households fought the same fight his had. He held children still while Delphine worked, boiled water over cook fires that weren't his, and said little, watching his wife move through other families' worst nights, with the same steadiness she had brought to his own. Of the 14 children who fell sick in that outbreak, 13 lived. The one who did not was a baby too young for Delphine to have reached in time. In a household 2 farms past where she had started, and she carried that loss the rest of her life the quiet way her father had carried his, without excuse and without forgetting it. Cordelia Vane, whose own grandson had been among the 13, stood on the Calder porch on the 7th morning, with a jar of preserves in her hands, and an expression Cedar Hollow had never once seen on her, which was something close to shame. "I said a hard thing about you at that social," she told Delphine. Standing very straight, The way a woman stands when she has decided to say something difficult and intends to get through it without flinching. I said a good many hard things after it, if I'm honest. And I don't believe I ever once asked what you actually were. Only what you weren't. She set the jar down on the porch rail. My grandson is alive because you sat up 2 nights in my daughter's house with your hands on his throat while I stood in the doorway wringing mine. I won't pretend that's a small thing, and I won't go on pretending I don't owe you an apology for the rest. Delphine took the jar without ceremony, because she had never been a woman who required an apology to be gracious, and told Cordelia only that she hoped the boy's throat would stay clear another week yet, and that he ought to sleep sitting up if the rasp came back. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was simply Delphine going on doing the only thing she had ever known how to do with cruelty, which was to treat the person in front of her as a patient rather than an enemy. Ida Prescott took longer to come around than Cordelia Vane, in part because Ida's dismissal of Delphine had never truly been about the girl at all. She found Delphine alone in the kitchen garden a week after the fever broke, weeding the rose Delphine had revived from nothing back in April, and stood at the fence for a long while before she spoke. My sister was Gideon's wife, Ida finally said. I promised her, before she died, that I'd keep this house and this child the way she would have. When the town married Gideon off to you, I thought I was watching a stranger walk into my sister's place. She looked down at her hands. I wasn't wrong that you were a stranger. I was wrong about everything else. Delphine straightened up from the row of beans, brushing dirt from her hands, and said that she had never once meant to take anyone's place, only to be of some use where she'd landed, and that she thought Hannah's mother, whoever she had been, would likely have wanted the same fever kept off her daughter's throat that any mother would have wanted. Ida was quiet a moment, turning that over. Her name was Margaret, she said finally, as if she had been waiting a long while for someone to ask, though nobody ever had. She had a temper and a soft heart, and she would have liked you, I think, once she got past being contrary about it, which she generally was at the start of most things. It was the first time Ida had said her sister's name aloud to Delphine since the wedding, and Delphine understood it for the gift it was, and did not press for more than what had been offered. Ida nodded slowly, and after a moment, in the manner of a woman handing over something she had held too tightly for too long, she asked whether Delphine would want help getting the tomato stakes in before the summer heat, which was, from Ida Prescott, as close to an open hand as either of them was likely to get, and close enough. Gideon Calder did not make a speech about any of it. He was not a man given to speeches, and the county had already had its fill of dramatic scenes that spring. What he did, on the Sunday 3 weeks after the fever broke, was walk with Delphine into the same churchyard where the wagon had nearly killed her, in front of the same congregation that had forced their marriage on a rumor, and when Reverend Cobb remarked from the pulpit, meaning it kindly, that the Lord worked in mysterious ways to bring good out of that April accident, Gideon stood up from the pew, which he had never once done in his life, and said, plainly, that there had been nothing mysterious about it at all. My wife saved 13 children in this county with her own 2 hands and her father's training, and half of you spent 3 years calling her an old maid with a bag of weeds while she did it, he said. I'd like that remembered. Next time this town decides it knows the value of a woman before it's bothered to ask. He sat back down. For a long moment the church was silent in a way Delphine had never once heard it. Not the busy, whispering silence of a congregation waiting for the next thing to gossip about, but something plainer and heavier. Then, 3 pews back, the mother of the youngest child Delphine had treated stood up without a word and simply nodded to her, once, and sat back down, and one by one down the pews a handful of others did the same, a small, wordless procession of people who had spent years not troubling themselves to look at her properly, and were now, belatedly, doing exactly that. Hollis, the young hand who had once complained of dried weeds, sat near the back with his hat in his lap and did not meet her eye, which Delphine took, correctly, for the closest thing to an apology the boy was capable of. Delphine, beside Gideon, said nothing, because she had never needed the room's good opinion the way the room seemed to need giving it, but she reached over and took his hand on the pew, in front of the whole congregation, and this time nobody in Cedar Hollow whispered a single word about it. The rest of that summer settled into something neither Gideon nor Delphine had expected on the Thursday evening he'd come to her door with his hat in his hands. Hannah began following Delphine into the physic garden most afternoons, learning the names of the plants the way Delphine had once learned them from her father. Foxglove for the heart, boneset for fever, Culver's root for a stomach gone wrong. And it was Hannah, not Delphine, who first suggested moving the honey milk cup ritual to the porch steps in the evening, instead of leaving it outside a closed door, because she said plainly one afternoon that she'd rather drink it where she could see her. It was a small thing, a 7-year-old choosing to be looked at rather than tended to from a distance, and Delphine understood it for exactly the door it was. By August, Hannah was asking, in the small, serious voice of a child who has decided something important, whether Delphine might teach her to read the ledger the way her own mother, she'd heard, used to keep the ranch accounts, and Delphine set aside an hour after supper twice a week for exactly that. The two of them bent over the same worn account book at the kitchen table, while Gideon read by the fire and pretended, not very well, not to be listening. Ida Prescott stayed on, not out of duty now, but because the household had quietly become one she chose to be part of, and the two women worked out between them, without either ever announcing it, a kitchen that belonged to them both. Gideon rode in most evenings to find his wife on the porch with her father's bag freshly restocked from the tinctures she still made in the little stone house behind what had once been Elias Hargrove's office. And he had stopped, sometime in July though, he couldn't have named the day, referring to their marriage as the thing the town had forced on him, because it no longer felt like a thing that had been forced on anyone. On a September evening, with the hill country cooling into the first breath of autumn, Delphine sat on the porch steps beside Gideon, while Hannah chased fireflies in the yard below, her laughter carrying up from the grass in a way it had not carried at all the spring Delphine arrived, and Ida's lamp burned steady in the kitchen window behind them where she was setting bread to rise for the morning. Gideon watched his daughter for a while without speaking, the particular quiet of a man who has learned, over a long year, to let silence sit instead of filling it, and then he asked Delphine, in the plain, unhurried way he asked most things, whether she had any regret in it, marrying a stranger on a scandal that wasn't of her making. Delphine thought about the 16 years the town had spent deciding what she was worth before it bothered to find out, and about her father's hands, and the 13 children breathing easy in their beds 2 counties wide that autumn because of what those hands had taught hers. "I spent a long while being told I'd missed my chance at a life," she said. "I don't think I missed it, Mr. Calder. I think it was only waiting on the right kind of trouble to find me." Gideon looked at her for a long moment in the fading light, and said that he supposed a runaway wagon was as strange a piece of trouble as any man could ask for, and that he'd spent most of that April Sunday certain the whole business would ruin both their lives rather than mend anything. Delphine, watching Hannah's small shape darting after the fireflies in the blue evening, said that some of the best things she'd ever known had arrived exactly that way, without warning and without anyone's particular blessing, and had turned out, given time, to be worth every bit of the trouble it took to get them. She did not say, because she had never been a woman who needed to say a thing twice to know it was true, that she had spent 16 years being told by Cedar Hollow what she was not, and had needed, in the end, only one hard night and one small girl's throat to show the county what she had been the entire time. Gideon reached over and took her hand the way he had in the churchyard, without ceremony, and the two of them sat that way a while longer, as the fireflies rose out of the grass, and the last light went out of the hills, and neither of them felt any particular need to say another word about it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.